Vic DiCarlo, who is a World War II veteran, just talking about his memories of Pearl Harbor, December 7th, 1941. He's coming out of a theater where? What neighborhood, Vic?
Bloomfield.
Bloomfield. What
Yeah.
movie was it?
Excuse me?
Do you remember what movie you saw?
No, I don't. No.
That's asking a lot, huh?
You know, after seeing that newsreel, it was things changed.
All right, let's get this started here, shall we?
Okay.
Hey, welcome everybody to Greatest Generation Live. It's good to see you again. For those of you who were at our dinner last night, this is a quick turnaround, but I'm glad you're joining us here. We are celebrating, or commemorating, I should say, the 79th anniversary coming of Pearl Harbor, which took place 79 years ago tomorrow. This is Pearl Harbor Day Eve, Sunday, December 6th, 2020. And our plan is to have people who remember Pearl Harbor certainly talk about their memories of that day, and also people who have other stories or stories or memories to share from maybe their family, talk about it a little bit. We also have some other guests here with us who have some other things to share. I see we have Henry Shepke's with us, I believe. Here we go. And Masters here. Very good. All right. Plenty of people. I'm still letting people in, so I'm buying some time here. How's everyone doing? Did everybody survive last night?
A couple of times, and that was fun.
You're not a good advertiser for our gala there, Bob. I saw Jack saying something. Jack Watson. Jack, how was you? Did you survive the night okay? Oh, he must have dropped off. All right. So, yeah. Hey, Dan, how are you? Good to see you.
Okay, how are you? I have a question for you, Todd.
Okay, shoot.
Tomorrow is December 7th. What time in the morning was it? 8:10? What time?
I think you're breaking up a little bit.
What was the time on December 7th?
December 7th was the attacks came, the first wave hit at like 7:53, right before 8 a.m. Oahu time. So that would have been what, like 1 in the afternoon, Pittsburgh time, maybe? Something like that. I think so. I think that's what it was. Hey, Leo, how are you?
Good. I first heard about Pearl Harbor when I was in 8th grade at 3 o'clock Sunday afternoon on the 7th.
And I remember, you grew up in Pittsburgh, Leo?
Yeah.
Yeah?
Actually in Irwin.
In Irwin. And I remember people saying that the weather was unusually nice day.
Yes, it was.
Day, December 7th. So a lot of kids were playing and heard the news. So you were in 8th grade. Did you have any idea where Pearl Harbor was? Or?
Yeah. Used to listen to Jack Armstrong on the paper. He was traveling all over the world.
Yeah, Jack Armstrong.
He had been to, I knew all about the Philippines and I'm trying to think, Indochina, of course, at that time. And so it was quite, very, very interesting to me.
So Leo,
I'm a world cultures teacher.
So even at that tender age, you were, I was going to say, you were a already a geography nerd, a kind of current events nerd, and I mean that in the most respectful, affectionate way, because that's kind of kid I was also. And then you grew up to become a teacher, a social studies teacher, a history teacher. How did your life change from that day forward?
We were in the process of revamping a building and making it into a home. And in August of that year, of 42, we moved to that new house. And then I started to St. Vincent at the prep. And so I didn't feel a lot, except I knew we couldn't move around very much because of the gas rationing. And I can remember worrying about whether my shoes were going to last or not.
Yes,
And,
shoes were a big deal. Yeah, you could only get 2 pair a year.
Right.
So- Yes. Huh. Yeah.
Things like that. And sugar, of course, was rationed. I learned to use what's the sugar substitute?
What did they use as sugar sub? Did they have you know, what did they have as a sugar substitute back then?
I think.
Saccharin? Was saccharin around?
I'm not sure what it was now. I mean,
Man,
They used honey. People used honey.
people
no,
used
I
honey.
didn't use honey.
Okay, so I want to very smart remark from Dana Del Bianco privately to me. If any of you were on a wonderful gala dinner last night, it was a lot of fun. It went a long time. But Ida May called me out on my pocket square. I had a very nice patriotic pocket square, red with a white star. And she said, like, what's that in your pocket? It doesn't quite look like a pocket square. And I had to take it out, and it was a sock. I don't have a pocket square, so I used a sock, and I thought I'd get away with it, but I didn't, all because of you, Ida May. So, but I'm not bitter or anything.
Where did you ever come up with the idea to use a sock? I mean, what ever crossed your mind that caused you to think a sock? A tie, maybe.
Well, here's my reasoning. My reasoning was this. My custom has been, when I do a Veterans Breakfast Club event, I wear red, white, and blue socks, and American flag socks with the Statue of Liberty on it, some kind of patriotic socks. And I didn't yesterday because it was a Saturday, and then I realized, we have our gala, and I opened up my sock drawer, and instead of changing my socks, I thought, I'll just put, I don't know. That's it. It made sense in my twisted brain.
Something I would do, yeah.
Hey, so let's just jump right into it then with the Pearl Harbor memories, because I know I want to share some information that hello, Henry, how are you?
Good. How are you?
Good. I'm going to share your video and your website in a little bit, but I just want to make sure you survived the night after your MRE dinner. Okay.
Yes, I did.
Okay, that's good. That's good. I'm glad. Yeah, mine was good. It was Japanese MRE with beef, and there was nothing in it that tasted even remotely like beef. I'm not sure what it was, but in any case, let's jump right in, and I want to share my screen here because it was, as Dan Vaughn kind of helped us remind us, it was 79 years ago tomorrow that the Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor. And it was early in the morning, right before 8 o'clock in the morning. The news hit, I think, Pittsburgh, the East Coast, afternoon, after lunchtime. And so from, 1 o'clock in the afternoon, say, till 8 o'clock in the evening, Americans were learning about what had happened at Pearl Harbor, and we're learning about the significance of the attack. And then by the end of the day, everybody pretty much knew that we were now at war with Japan. And the attacks came in 2 waves. The attackers had left on 6 aircraft carriers from the Kuril Islands, just north of Japan. They had traveled in radio silence 3,500 miles all the way to the Hawaiian Islands. And they stopped about 250 miles north of Oahu. And on these 6 carriers were about 400 airplanes. And on the morning of December 7th, the 400 airplanes or 350 airplanes took off in 2 great waves. And they delivered a pretty devastating blow to one of the most important naval bases that the U.S. had, that was oriented toward the Pacific and toward East Asia. Within 2 hours, these Japanese attacks had sunk or had hit at least 8. All 8 battleships had been hit. I believe 4 had been sunk, 2 had been damaged heavily. They had also damaged or sunk at least 20 other ships. couple hundred airplanes, over 2,400 sailors and soldiers and airmen would die. Civilians would die, about 1,100 injured and wounded. And as far as the Japanese go, they lost, I think, 65 or so of the flyers. Some in the midget submarines. One Japanese sailor was captured and held for the duration of the war. And it was kind of a wildly successful strike in the short term. Wildly successful. In the long term, it was a disaster, and we could talk about that and why. And I just thought I'd share some pictures from that day, quite a few of them. It was sudden. It was devastating. It was, in retrospect, it should have been expected, but it wasn't. It wasn't. It was an off-duty day. It was a Sunday. Here's some sailors at Ford Island looking at an exploding USS Shaw, which was a destroyer. The Nevada, battleship Nevada, is next to it. Here's another shot of Ford Island, a building on fire. So you could get a sense of the devastation. Apparently, Admiral Yamamoto thought that this attack he's the one who, he was the genius behind the attacks, but he thought they were a bad idea. And one of the minor reasons he thought it was a bad idea was that it was shallow water in Pearl Harbor, and that any ships that were sunk could kind of easily be salvaged, which in fact is what happened. And he also suspected that a lot of sailors would be on leave, not on duty, and that they would not be able to kill a lot of Americans that day. And that also ended up being true. These are the Pittsburgh Press and the Pittsburgh Sun-Telegraph from December 8th. And you can see how they reported the story. And I would just love to hear from people like Leo, who remember that day and might have a memory to share. Dan Vaughn, yes.
One more question, Todd. I believe I understood that there was one aircraft carrier that was never in Pearl Harbor, was out in the ocean somewhere, and it survived the attack. Do you remember the name of the carrier?
I think we had 3 carriers, and
Okay.
somebody here I know will know the names of all 3. The Lexington, the Yorktown, all 3 were gone. All 3 were at sea. And so there were no carriers hit. The big ships that were hit, the heart of the Pacific Fleet, were the battleships.
Okay.
And they were devastated. They were devastated. All of them except the Arizona were salvaged. And I think all of them except the Arizona and one more, I can't remember, ended up fighting in World War II. They were salvaged, they were repaired, and they were put back into action. So it was a devastating attack on the Pacific Fleet. And the intention, strangely, and we could talk about it later, the intention of the Japanese was to avoid a war with the U.S. by attacking us at Pearl Harbor. That was their intention. They were afraid if they didn't attack, there would be war. Backwards thinking in some ways, but let's, anybody else remember? Yeah, Dan.
Hey, Todd.
Yes.
The answer's in the chat on the 3 carriers.
Oh, I knew. We have such a smart crowd here.
And
should
number
just shut up.
2, Henry has the name of the pilot of the plane that you shown.
Yeah, his name's Earl T. Williams.
Okay, hold on a second. Okay, so Dana Del Bianco, Smarty Pants, knows the names of the 3 carriers. I'm sure other people here, I'm looking at half a dozen people here who I'm sure would know these details. The Yorktown, the Lexington, the Enterprise, they were all at sea, correct? Bob Book, why don't you unmute yourself and Chris
I think
Perolo, you know
they
that.
were at sea, and that's why they were saved.
Okay, Chris?
Admiral Halsey actually took them out on a patrol or on an exercise, or he was told to go out south of the harbor, south of the island, and that's where they were, totally out of range, totally as far away from the Japanese as you could get them. But it was Halsey that took that task force out to sea, and it fueled a lot of the suspicion that we really know about an attack.
Right.
But it just had to be a fortuitous circumstance that they moved out of the harbor on some exercise, and it was Halsey who was leading that. He pulled in the next day, and he told everybody, "Hey, whatever you do, get us out of here in 48 hours. I don't want to be here if they come back.
So Henry, which airplane are you talking about that you know the pilot?
That one.
This one. Tell us about it.
Well, his name's Earl T. Williams. He recently passed away, but I have like 3 index cards signed by him. If you go to my website, you can see them if anybody wants to see it.
Okay. And he was the pilot of this airplane. And was it in the air and crashed, or was it hit on the ground? Do you know anything about that?
Well, I'm pretty sure he's the one in that photo. But he was just flying around and happened to be at Pearl Harbor in the vicinity during that day and was shot down, I believe. So.
Oh, how interesting. How interesting. Oh my gosh. We have such an interesting group here who join us on these events. Let me ask you, I see that Jean Klebingott is with us. I'm going to ask you to unmute Jean. And then I'm going to ask you if you remember December 7th, 1941. Let's see here. Let's see. I'm going to ask to unmute. Okay, we'll come back to you, Jean. You'll get unmuted. Warren, Goss, Mary Goss, do you guys remember it? Good to see you.
Well, I'll put my 2 cents in. I was 13 years old when this happened, and I can remember vividly sitting on the floor in front of the radio in the living room when they were announcing that we were bombed by the Japanese. And we were told that there had been 3 Japanese ambassadors at the White House at the time. And they knew about this attack and nothing was said. And when President Roosevelt heard about it, and he seemed to be very agitated. And as I was listening to this as a youngster, it was hard for me to picture being attacked by an enemy. And my immediate thought was of New York City and picturing soldiers pouring into that city and over our land. And what would we do? Where would we go? But as a youngster, it was frightening because this was the first time we've ever faced anything like this in our lives.
Yeah.
But at that particular time, my folks were very anxious. And that's when my father began looking for a farm.
Yeah, he changed his whole, you moved because of it.
Yes, we moved. This was in December. And by Good Friday, the following Easter, which was only 3 or 4 months away, we moved into a farmhouse and a 112-acre farm because he knew, coming from Europe, from the Ukraine, they knew that to survive, you're going to have animals and you're going to have food. And that was his thought. So we sold our home. And as a matter of fact, we traded it in on the family who lived on our street, who had a farm and it was vacant. And they made an equal trade, our house for their farm.
So you were living in a house in, was it Baden, Beaver County?
No, we were living in Koppel.
In
That's
Koppel.
North of Beaver Falls, about 7 miles.
So you were living in a town in Beaver County, and your
Yes.
dad, your parents, who were immigrants from Ukraine, they knew about war, of course, in Europe, and they knew about starving in war. And so his immediate reaction after Pearl Harbor was, we've got to move to a farm so that we'll have enough to eat.
Right.
That's
And-
amazing.
So we moved within, on Good Friday, we were moving into the farmhouse at that point, cleaning it up and fumigating it and tearing off wallpaper that was there since the Civil War. It was a big old farmhouse that was built during the Civil War. And it still had wallpaper on it from years and years ago. And I can remember how hard my mother worked and I trying to make it livable. But, and I do remember at that time also when the rationing came in, when butter was rationed, and you had to have food stamps, and you used those food stamps when you went to purchase your food. And if you were allowed so many food stamps per family.
Right.
And also, I remember when going to school, immediately they began to sell stamps, war bonds.
Right.
And we children would buy the little stamp books, and maybe for 10 cents you received one stamp, and you would paste it in your book. And when that was filled up, then you could cash it in or save it. It would be more valuable if you saved it, because it turned into a bond. So you had one bond, war bond.
Right.
So I still have that booklet. As a matter of fact, I was just looking at it last evening, and I have 2 of those saving books. They're probably worth, I don't know if they'd be worth anything today, but in those days, once you filled the stamp book, then it was equal to a bond. That we children would begin saving our chewing gum wrappers, especially the aluminum foil wrappers around the gum stick, and make it into a ball. Anything that was had any kind of aluminum on it, we saved and immediately began saving that for the war effort. And also, I can remember we children would go down searching along a railroad track for iron spikes that maybe were fallen or left along the railroad track from the workers. And we'd gather up those iron spikes and sell them for scrap. So as young as we were just thrown into the idea of saving for the war effort and collecting for the war effort.
Yeah. You know, Mary, your kind of testimony, it just reminds me of 2 things. Number one, we should do more programs on the war front or on the home front in World War II, because the rationing, the scrap drives, those stories are so interesting. So I definitely want to schedule some where we could have you and others come back and talk about that. And number 2 is I have this theory that I developed after working on a project that young people were really the people who were pushing the effort to win the war in World War II, that older people like your parents, they weren't excited about this war. They had lived through wars before, and they saw how devastating it was. But you all were young and dumb. You hadn't experienced it yet. And so you were gung-ho. And so you're the ones who really spearheaded the scrap drives and the recruitment drives and the, war bond drives and all the other drives. Let me ask Warren. Warren, do you remember December 7th, 1941? Do you remember when Pearl Harbor was attacked?
Yeah, I remember, but all I did was sell more papers.
That's it. You sold papers, so that was a big day.
Yeah, I was 16, and the guy called me up and says, "Warren, we're sending you out the papers on Pearl Harbor. You better get up there and sell papers." And I did. And boy, oh boy, did I sell papers.
Where did you sell papers? Like on a street corner or somewhere?
Yeah, by Royal Boulevard, up in Mount Royal Boulevard.
Yeah.
And I'd haul an extra paper, and it's in the country, and everyone had to travel that road to get to work and go to Pittsburgh anyway. And everybody was stopping and buying a paper, and they'd pay me for that paper, and I'd get more money for those papers than I ever had in all the time I peddled papers. They never waited for change.
So you truly shouted extra, extra.
Yeah, I didn't even know what Pearl Harbor was. I didn't have any idea what I was doing.
You were 16 years old. When did somebody finally tell you, or when did it dawn upon you that this was going to impact your life?
I don't know. Maybe I don't know how to say it, but maybe my mother and dad was the one. My dad was the one who was mostly worried. He said, "It looks like I'm going to lose my boys," is what he said.
Oh boy!
And I figured, what you going to lose them for, And he told me. And
Again,
he had 3 boys in there. That's all.
A World War I veteran, so he knew war.
Hey, Todd.
Yeah.
My wife said she had 12 acres.
Yeah.
112. Yeah, she's wrong. It's 112.
112.
That's what they got on that farm. Yeah.
And what did they grow on Mary's parents' farm?
Well, it was mostly a cattle farm.
Okay.
They had a lot of pasture, a lot of wheat and oats they had, and corn. And outside of that, the rest was most of it was for cattle.
Huh.
Oh, I know. Another a memory was when we had our first potato crop on the farm. My father liked to play Santa Claus, even when we were kids. And what he would do is get a sack of potatoes and leave it on people's front porch. And some of them never knew where it came from. And he just distributed sacks of potatoes and dropped them off at various houses in and around the farm and the neighborhood. So many of them talked about that even when I was grown up. And they said, oh, we'll never forget your father, how he used to leave potatoes on our front porch.
Oh, how neat.
So we did grow a lot of potatoes.
Gene Klebingott, we see the top of your head, but I think we can hear you now. How are you?
Terrific. If I feel any better, I'd be worried.
Do you remember December 7th, 1941?
Oh, yes, very much. I was 14. I turned 14 in June that year. And I was visiting I was born and raised in Wilmerding.
Mm-hmm.
I'm also the youngest of 7 children. And with my mother and I was visiting her, one sister in Pitcairn. And on the way back from Pitcairn, my brother-in-law come running up and he told us about the war, about us being in war now. And he says, if you're 21, he says, as soon as you turn 21, you're going to get drafted. Well, at 14, I figured, hell, the war will be over before that. But I was very fortunate. Well, I wanted to go to the Army. And I think around March or April of 42, they changed the law from 21 to 18.
Correct. Yes.
And then the first 18-year-olds went in, I think, in 43. By the time they set everything up,
right,
to draft him.
Right.
So, but one of the nicest things at 14, I did get a job as a pin boy because the Westinghouse was starting to employ everybody, and I spent the pins at the YMCA. I got 3 cents a line.
A pin boy, and what is that? Setting up bowling pins?
Yeah. 10. These were duck pins.
Duck pins.
Yeah, the small one. Yeah.
I should let people know. I'm too young to understand what it was like to set pins. By the time I started bowling, there were automatic, pin setters. But it sounds like a horrible job working, standing in the back of a bowling alley, having all the the pins kind of go everywhere. Then you gather them up and have to reset them.
With your these small pins, you had a pedal, you had to push, and pins came up. And you had to sit them all on the pins.
You had to sit them on the pins.
Yes. And sometimes I would take care of 2 alleys at one time, jumping back and forth. Hey, remember, this was a depression I was coming out of, and here at 14, I'm starting to make money. Wow!
Yeah,
I could hardly believe it.
So your older brothers must have gone into the service after Pearl Harbor.
No, there was quite a year difference between them. My oldest brother was 15 years older than me, and the next brother was 11.
Okay.
So they were still at home. My one brother just graduated in 1934 from Union High School in Turtle Creek.
Okay.
So,
all right.
But when I turned 16, then you could work at the Westinghouse Air Brake. You had to have a work permit from the plant, and your parents had to sign, and the school doctor had to sign it also.
And is that what
we-
you got? You got a job at Westinghouse Air Brake at age 16?
Yes, at 16, you could work, we was allowed to work 44 hours a week. And the minimum wage then was 78 cents an hour. And we would get the time and a half for overtime, but we could work 4 hours overtime. Or if you work 40 hours, you could work 4 hours on Saturday. And then when school started, if you maintained a C average in school, you could work 4 hours after school from from 4 to 8.
Oh, wow.
And then on Saturday we could work 4 hours.
Jeez.
Wait, and when I first got that first pay from making 78 cents an hour, I thought I was a multimillionaire.
Would you share with us how you got your tips when you were setting pins?
Did you get tips setting pins?
Yeah, you would get tips, and in my little town of Portview, they had a club there that had 2 duck pin lanes, and my classmates set pins. After the bowling league was over, all the bowlers would take their change and throw it down the alley. And that was your tips.
I just picture cowering in the back and having the pins go everywhere, and then you had to rush around and put them back.
Well, they had a little place where the pin boy could jump up onto a shelf, like, and it kind of protected him.
Okay.
And he would get hit with pins sometimes, and that was those little pins that had the rubber ring around them.
Yeah, they had a rubber ring around.
Oh man.
Boy, am I getting old, Todd.
Hey, exactly. Yes, we ain't getting younger. Vic DiCarlo. Vic is with us. Vic grew up in Bloomfield, an Italian neighborhood of Pittsburgh. And you're a World War II vet. You were in the 80th Infantry Division. I'm going to ask you to unmute. If you could click unmute there, Vic. I muted you, so you have to unmute yourself. If you can click, there should be a button that says unmute.
Get a guy like me and say that I'm done.
We hear you, Warren. Hey, Vic, how are you?
Hey, how are you?
Good. So do you remember, does this ring any bells? December 7th, 1941.
Yeah, as I say, I was coming out of a theater and I saw the newsreel about the Pearl Harbor incident. And so that was how I got my information.
And you would have been like 15 years old or so?
Yes, I was. Yeah.
Do you remember anything like in school the next day? I remember hearing that when kids went to school the next day, the principal would gather the kids and try to explain to them what was going on. Do you remember anything like that?
Yeah, I think they had a get together in the auditorium.
Yeah.
And to talk to the people about the situation and how things would probably change.
Right. Hey, hear Delia in the background.
Yeah, she's answering the phone.
Well, and I mentioned to Vic that we would love to have him and his wife Delia, who grew up in Italy in World War II and lived through the war in Italy, have them come on and share their stories, because they're really remarkable stories. Thank you, Vic. How about Julia Parsons? Julia, you could unmute yourself.
Okay.
Yep. How are you, Julia?
I'm fine, thanks. Well, I made it through last night. That's good.
That is good. Your tuna, you had the lemon pepper tuna, right?
No, I had the shredded beef and barbecue sauce.
That's right.
It was really good. I like that.
That's good. We'll
And
put you on the commercial.
The white wine was also delicious.
Thank you, Julia. We'll put you on the commercial for the next one instead of Bob
Good.
Buck. Do you remember December 7th, 1941?
I do. I remember it well, and I seem to be the only one who had never even heard of Pearl Harbor. I hear everybody else saying they knew all about it. I don't think that I'd ever heard it before. And I heard this on the car radio while I was going to visit a friend. I was a senior in college at that point, and I just was shocked because I didn't have any idea where Pearl Harbor was, and I had no idea that it was going to affect my whole life, but it did.
Yeah. And so you were a senior at Carnegie Tech, now Carnegie Mellon, and you graduated then the following May?
Yes. And the boys at on campus the next day, everybody had a telephone of some sort or radio, and they held this up to there. They were all terrified because they were mostly ROTC members, and they knew they'd have to go, but they were given till the end of the year to leave.
Right.
So, but they were very upset.
I can
But
imagine.
At the time, I thought they were being kind of silly.
Yeah.
But they really had a reason to be upset. And
Yeah.
I think I was too naive to understand what this was all about.
When did you decide that you wanted to join the Navy? How long after your graduation?
Well, right away I wanted to, because all the boys were going and they all got to do exciting things, I thought. Some did and some didn't. But
Right.
I wanted to do something exciting too. So, and since the market was wide open for women at that point, jobs were plentiful.
Did you tell me that your sister also joined?
She belonged to Traveler's Aid. I don't know if you ever heard of.
Yes.
I think they're still around.
They are.
They helped. She was stationed outside of Norfolk, Virginia, and got to. They found homes for sailors and sailors' families, that kind of thing.
Right.
That was a big call for that because they were moved around constantly, and I guess their families followed them. I don't remember the details on that. But until they went on sea duty, then they got to live in town.
And I love the fact that your father didn't fight you about joining the Navy and was very proud that you had
Yes, well,
joined.
he had no sons, and everyone else did, so he was happy to be able to hang the little flag in the window.
Yeah. Yeah.
So, yeah,
I
he
love
was,
that.
The only warnings I got were from people who were warning me against both predatory men and predatory women, and I had to be very careful. And I don't recall ever being challenged in any way at all.
That's good. So the
in
Navy,
service.
the Navy treated you well.
They did. And since everybody was in, there was no, what am I trying to say? Everybody went somewhere. In the
Right.
group of girls, there were 13 of us, and 8 of us went in the service, either as nurses or some type of Red Cross workers. Everybody did. The others were married, which I thought was very dull at that point. So they followed their husbands around from post to post. So
Oh,
it was
how-
just, and everybody left. Just everybody was gone. Every house had a flag in the window. I don't think there were any houses that didn't have.
Yeah.
If they had children that was of that age, they were gone.
You know, you're reminding me of my mother. Her story was she grew up in McKees Rocks Bottoms on Ellis Street, and she remembers Pearl Harbor Day, and she remembers a fuss in the household. You know, uncles that were going to be called up for war. A lot of conversation about that, and she asked her mother what was going on, and her mother was looking out the window down the alley, and her mother just said, "War is coming." And so my mom said, you know, she was 7 years old at the time. Every time she would look out the window down the alley, wondering when the war was going to come down the alley. That was to her. That was what was going to happen. Let me ask Jack Morrow, how are you?
Just fine, sir. How are you?
Good. Do you remember that day?
Oh, my, yes. I was hanging out with a bunch of young fellows downtown, Canning, Pennsylvania. On a nice sunny afternoon. It was beautiful. And we heard rumors about this was going on. And we just sort of all broke up and went home to hear about what was going on. But after that, I remember when we had Air Force, having air raid warnings or with practices. And the Boy Scouts, and I was very active in that at the time. And we were working as air raid warnings to walk around the streets during the blackouts.
Yes.
What was going on. And while I was, after I graduated from high school in 43, before I could win the service and have my parents sign for me, they said I had to wait till after my brother was on his leave from the Naval Academy when he was attending at the time.
Right.
And so when on that time period, I was working at the Elgin Pottery in Ford City, where they made bathroom fixtures. So that was my job after graduation, before I went into the service in the Marine Corps.
That was what work. So you worked in a plant making bathroom fixtures.
Making bathroom fixtures, you know,
right.
Bathtubs and urinals and all those sort of things. Yes.
Right. Huh.
It was very interesting times. It was, you know, we didn't know what was going on. We were too young to realize what the whole concept was.
Right.
To get into it ourselves.
Right. And so you knew, were you able to figure out kind of right away that you wanted to get involved somehow, or that you were going to get involved?
Well, the day before Pearl Harbor happened, I had my 16th birthday. So as you recognize yesterday, I was 95 years old.
So your birthday is December 5th?
December 6th.
Today's December 6th.
Well, but the sun was December 7th.
Right.
So on this day, 95 years old, I was born.
So you're happy birthday, Jack, 95.
Thank you very much. I feel very healthy and very, very happy with my family. They've all contacted me, and everything's wonderful when you have your family gathering around you.
Jack, I'm so happy that you're spending your 95th birthday with us here. Do you have any secrets to longevity?
Well, I always tell everybody it is my vodka gimlet every night.
Vodka every night?
Vodka gimlet.
Vodka gimlet every night.
And Rose's lime juice and ice cubes.
Oh, I got to write that down. So a vodka gimlet is, what is the recipe?
It's Rose's lime juice.
Rose's
and
lime.
Vodka. As strong as you want to make it.
Okay.
And ice cubes, and that's it.
And ice cubes. Oh, I'm so glad to hear that. I thought you were going to say exercise, clean living. This is
a foreign language to me.
Yeah, this is something I could do. All right. Thank you, Jack, and happy birthday. Oh my gosh. That is so great. We have another, Jack Watson. We had another World War II vet here with us. Before we go on to others, Jack Watson, I'm going to ask you to unmute if you can, and let us know if you remember December 7th, 1941.
I do remember that.
Yeah.
I was a senior in high school, and we heard about the attack on Pearl Harbor. We're like everybody else. We didn't know where Pearl Harbor was. We didn't know anything about it. And probably in November of 41, I hated school. And I was hoping if we only had a war, I wouldn't have to go to school. Well, that turned out not true. We had a war and I still had to go to school. I stayed in school and graduated in June. But I'm surprised that Jack at 95, he looks a lot better than I do. I'm only 96.
You need to start drinking vodka gimlets, I think.
Yes. I made that recipe.
I love that. I love it. Oh man. Who else? Is anybody else? I know that we have Scott Masters here. Thank you for joining us, Scott. And I know you have a Pearl Harbor story or two to share with you. Bob Book. Yes.
I have a kind of Pearl Harbor story to share.
Okay.
Years ago, it was my first Pitt football game when I bought season tickets and went into my beloved section 22, and it was Pitt Notre Dame. And there was a man sitting down at the end of my aisle, and he was yelling at Notre Dame. And one of his comments was, "God, I know it's Rosh Hashanah, but we got to beat these Catholics." So later on in the game, there was a young man who was a Notre Dame fan. He had on a shirt that had linebacker bar and grill South Bend, Indiana on the back. So Notre Dame comes down, they score a touchdown, and this gentleman yells, "You wait till you need a liver transplant, linebacker. You'll like Pitt then." So I look at my friend and I said, "Who is this guy?" And he says, "That's just Doc." He said, that's the way he is. Well, a couple games later, I see people coming in, and they're walking up to him with bags, and they're taking books out, and he's signing these books. And I said to Bill, "Bill, what's he doing signing those books?" He said, "Well, you know that Doc wrote this book, At Dawn We Slept."
Right.
The definitive book on Pearl Harbor. It was written by Gordon W. Prang, who was a history professor at a beloved history professor at the University of Maryland. So Doc, Warren Prang had died. So Doc, with Warren Prang's secretary, Catherine V. Dillon, wrote this book. They finished the book for Gordon Prang. So over the years, I would see Doc at the games and everything like that. And I took my book and had him autograph it for me. And he wrote to Bob. He said, "In the final analysis at Pearl Harbor, they caught us asleep, by God."
Huh.
So years had gone by, and Todd, you know that I was the ED of the World War II Memorial Fund.
Right.
And they were going to put historical panels up down there, which they did, the glass panels with the history data. And he had called me, and I knew that the woman that they had engaged to do that, I wasn't in that position anymore, but Doc called me and he said, "That woman doesn't know what she's doing." He goes, "Yeah." So he was challenging. So anyway, he in later years, he was retiring from Pitt because he taught history there. He donated all of his World War II historical information to the University of Pittsburgh. And I just found out, I was thinking about, and I remember one time I was watching the History Channel on December 7th, late at night, and who pops on the screen but Doc? And they're interviewing him on the History Channel. And then I know Sally Wiggin interviewed him a few times.
And wasn't his name, was that Donald Goldstein?
It
Was
was
that his
Donald
name?
Goldstein.
Yeah.
And so as years went by, and he asked me about the World War II thing. And I think the last time I saw him was at Heinz Field. And ironically, he sat in my section. So we chatted a little bit, and then he moved, I think, to North Carolina, where he passed away in December. But if I can share with you one of my favorite pictures of Doc, this was the last game at Pitt Stadium. And I had smuggled a bottle of champagne, and I had cigars, which I distributed. But umbrellas were not permitted at Pitt football games, and they announced this all the time. So here's my picture of Doc holding an umbrella.
Quietly holding an umbrella. Oh, great.
Thank you for letting me have that time.
Thank you.
Todd. I
Thank you
appreciate
very
that.
much,
You're
Bob.
my friend.
That's great. That's terrific. I know, Bert Kennedy, you were old enough to remember Pearl Harbor, I think. You're not you're a vet, but not a World War II vet. If you want to unmute yourself at some point and let us know what you remember that day, please do.
Well, I was only 6 years old. And my family was out on testing out their new car, 41 Ford. I was sitting in the back seat. Dad heard something on the radio. We had to pull over. And that was the announcement of the war. And as a kid, I became a junior commando to begin with, then into the Cub Scouts, and we were always on scrap drives.
Right.
Picking up paper and any kind of metal. And one summer, we actually went down and was collecting milkweed pods. My job at home was to make the margarine.
Okay, but you got to tell us what the milkweed pods were used for, because I do remember, were they life vests?
They were supposed to be used for life vests. I don't think it worked out. I believe it was a failure.
It was a waste of time.
Yeah.
A lot of those scrap drives were a waste of time.
You know.
Yeah.
But there was a lot of rationing, and my uncle was delivered coal, so he had a better ratio, better sticker than my dad did. So every once in a while, he'd give my dad some gas.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
But my job was at home was to make the margarine. You had to bust the little thing and then knead it until it all became a yellow color.
Yes, because butter could not be found during most of the years of the war. And so your dad probably had an A card, which just entitled him to maybe 3 to 5 gallons of gas a week.
Yeah.
But if you delivered coal, you could get a B card, which meant 8 or 10 gallons of gas a week. And there's a big difference. Is that interesting? I love that. Let's see. Do you have anyone else? I know we have, Jim Jameson. Why don't you unmute yourself, Jim?
Sorry. There's a note in the comments from Mike Mayer about a local fellow who was aboard the USS Tracy. You may want to ask Mike about that.
Hey, Mike. Good to see you. Mike is going to be our featured guest next week. You will not believe his story. He said he is truly the world's leading expert on something called Kai-10, which were the Japanese suicide torpedoes, piloted torpedoes in World War II. Mike has spent a couple decades doing research and writing a wonderful book. He generously sent me a few copies. We might be giving them away next week. Absolutely fascinating stuff, Mike. Thank you so much for this book. Anyhow, that's an introduction. You're going to hear from Mike again next week, but I just want to let people know who you were. So, Mike, how are you doing?
I'm doing good, Todd. Thank you. And appreciate your little segue into your episode and the show next week.
Yes.
Looking forward to it. I've been in contact with some of the guests that we've been talking about, and they're eager to participate. So it'll be good.
And I have to tell people,
And
Mike,
so, yeah, the book.
I'm going to interrupt you, Mike. I just want people to know that you have pneumonia and your wife has COVID-19. And I hope you're feeling okay.
Much better.
Okay.
Much better.
Okay.
And my wife is doing well.
Okay.
Yeah, the story I had to share about Pearl Harbor is there was a local fellow here, Warren Bowden, who was serving aboard an old four-stacker destroyer, USS Tracy. Now, the Tracy was in dry dock. She had her guns and a lot of her equipment stripped from the ship because they were doing maintenance and work on the ship at that point in time. And he recalls on the morning of December 7th, the Japanese airplanes coming in over the submarine base, which was very close to the dry dock where his ship was at. And he said they began to drop torpedoes and, of course, bomb Battleship Row. And as soon as they saw what was going on, Warren and a few other sailors went and jumped into a launch and started heading across the harbor to try and reach Battleship Row so they could start pulling sailors out of the water and trying to help save some of the men. Well, they got about halfway across the harbor, and Japanese Zeros that were escorting the torpedo aircraft and the dive bombers ended up shooting a lot of holes in the bottom of their launch, and they started to sink. And as Warren explained, he said, at that point, once we started sinking, we were all done being heroes, and we headed back to the Tracy. And he said, we didn't have any guns. However, the four stacker right next to them did have guns, but of course the ammunition lockers were all locked up under lock and key. And he said, so he and other sailors from the Tracy started assisting their fellow sailors. They started breaking open the ammunition lockers and uncovering the guns and started to fire back. And he said a young ensign came up to them and started chewing them out because they didn't have permission to open fire. And Warren explained that he just took the guy and he said he threw him overboard. But he said it was a horrific day, one he'll never forget.
Boy, is that a good story.
I have him about 2 hours on film, on video in the early 80s, explain this. And yet his family had never asked him about it. And it wasn't until 3 or 4 years after he died that the family finally came to me and asked, do you still have that video of Dad? Which I was able to make DVDs for all of them.
Now, your dad served in the Navy, as you'll talk about next week, in World War II. Did he ever share, what he remembered from Pearl Harbor Day?
Yes, he did. I did write about it in the book. He was a boy that was in high school at the time, and he was in the house listening to the Chicago Bears football game on that particular Sunday. Of course, this was in early Sunday afternoon when they first started to hear the first radio broadcasts.
Yeah.
He was in the house with his parents. His brothers were out on the family farm rabbit hunting out on the frozen ground. And he heard the news, and so he bolted out the door. He ran across the frozen farm fields yelling at his brothers that the Japanese have attacked Pearl Harbor, out in the Hawaiian Islands. And he said after that day, his brothers always called him Paul Revere. I guess for breaking the news, what had happened. He said his mother became really somber for the rest of the day because she had 4 boys that were eligible to go into the military at the time, and they all served.
Yeah. I think often that the people who really suffered after Pearl Harbor with the news of Pearl Harbor were the parents of kids who were teenagers then. The teenagers, again, they were too young and dumb, but the parents had all remembered World War I, and they remembered the devastation of that war. And I just can't imagine what the fear and anxiety, must have gripped parents who knew that their sons and sometimes daughters were going off to war. Amazing to think about. Scott Masters, how are you doing, Mr. Masters?
I'm doing very well, Todd. Thank you. You can tell I've just left my school name on there. That's why it's Mr. Masters.
Oh,
you guys can call me Scott.
We can call you Scott. All right.
Absolutely.
Good. You'll remember that Scott Masters teaches history and social studies at the Crestwood Preparatory College in Toronto, Canada. And you are the director and founder of the Crestwood Oral History Project, which is just a massive oral history project that encompasses a lot of different topics, but World War II and veterans is one important kind of subheading of your oral history project. You must have heard some great stories about Pearl Harbor over the years.
Yeah, absolutely. And I was thinking about that, and there's probably 3 of them that really come to mind the most. One of them was with an American veteran by the name of Ben Snyder, who just passed away a few years ago. He was attending Princeton at the time, and he vividly remembered being in his fraternity. I think he was a junior in university, if I remember correctly. And he and all of his friends just went and got involved in the military pretty much the following week or the week after. And Ben ended up going into the Air Force, and he was a pilot on a B-24 Liberator within a couple of years. And he served his war in the Pacific, and he was just a fantastic guy, and just incredible memories of everything he went through. The vast majority of my interviews have been with Canadian soldiers, so they certainly remember hearing the news. And the two that I remember most vividly, one was with a man named Norm Cohen, who was a teenager in Toronto, and he was just about to turn 18, so he knew he was going to be joining up soon. But he remembered hearing FDR on the radio. I guess it would have been on the Monday, December the 8th, and FDR's speech motivated him and his friends to join. I don't think they found the Canadian Prime Minister Mackenzie King to be quite so charismatic, but FDR really, struck a nerve with them, and they all went and joined up that week. And Norm ended up serving in Burma. He was part of the Burma Star Flight, supplying the British Army in Southeast Asia. But the one that strikes me the most is a guy by the name of George MacDonnell, who was part of the Canadian force in Hong Kong at that time. And the troops down there learned about the attacks on Pearl Harbor, and they themselves were under attack by the Japanese a day or two later. And George ended up serving the balance of the war in Japanese POW camps. And he always remembered the significance of Pearl Harbor and is deeply thankful to the Americans who liberated him 4 years later.
Oh, man. Do you know anything about, since you're in Canada, about Americans who joined the Royal Air Force early, before Pearl Harbor, because they wanted to get in on the fight? I know quite a few did, but I don't know the numbers, and I'm not that familiar with their stories. That's an interesting story. I don't know if you've ever run across those veterans.
I've come across a few, because there's a number of Americans who came north to Canada. Canada was heavily involved in something called the British Commonwealth Air Training Plan. Thousands of pilots and aircrew members came to Canada for their training, and there was an awful lot of Americans who came up in 1940. So I've spoken to a number of Canadians who had especially American flight instructors, because there was a dearth of pilots at the time. So a lot of the Americans who came up ended up serving as flight instructors. A fair number of them did go over and serve in the RAF as well, but they had to be very crafty about how they managed to get over there.
Okay.
And I came across one veteran who told me a fascinating story. They migrated to northern Manitoba, and they actually ended up getting on cattle ships sailing through Hudson Bay across the North Atlantic to Britain. And that was how they had to contrive to get there. And once they got there, they were able to get into the RAF.
Oh, how interesting. Boy, what an interesting story that is. How neat, Scott. Scott, you are welcome to join us anytime you want to. And I also want you to, pitch the Oral History Project or make the appeal here. I know, again, we have World War II veterans here who I don't know if they've connected with you to schedule an interview, but could you let people know about the project?
Yeah, absolutely. I continue to meet every week. I take students. Nowadays, of course, we're doing all of this in Zoom and going around the world. Just this morning, I took a group of 21 students to Jerusalem, and we did an hour-and-a-half interview with a Holocaust survivor who lives there. Next week, we're going out to Vancouver, and we're going to be interviewing a Canadian Spitfire pilot. Whenever we find somebody who wants to talk with us, we are more than happy to get together. And I have lots of students who really do enjoy the opportunity to speak to somebody in their 90s. Many of them have never had the chance, and they really do enjoy it.
Oh, isn't that interesting? I wonder, is there anybody here? Have you've connected with Julia Parsons, I hope, maybe Jack Watson?
I've connected with Julia, and we haven't done an interview yet, but we've sort of set the groundwork for one, and we will be doing that probably in the new year, since we're getting pretty close to the Christmas break. And I also spoke with, his name has just
Jack Watson.
No, it wasn't Jack Watson. It was the gentleman from Maine, Roland Glenn.
Oh, Roland Glenn. Good.
Yeah.
Okay.
But those are the only two I've made definite plans with so far.
Okay, well, we have Warren Goss. He looks like he's trying to hide from the screen, but I see him. We have Victor Carlo. We have Jack Watson. We have Gene Klebingot. So Jack Morrow. So we have other veterans too. I'll twist their arms, Scott, and make sure that they talk to your students, because I just think it's such a valuable thing for young people to hear and learn about.
Yeah, I agree. Absolutely. Anybody who wants to, by all means, get in touch. I'm sure Todd would be happy to facilitate that.
I absolutely would. Absolutely would. Do we have Kirk Donsky here with us? Kirk? Are you here? You are. Kirk, sorry, your iPad. I didn't realize you were here. Good to see you. Thank you so much for joining us. Why don't you unmute yourself? Oh, I just muted you. Unmute yourself again if you can, Kirk. Boy, I'm grateful that you joined us because good to see you. You're coming to us from you're coming to us from Wisconsin, right?
That's correct. La Crosse, Wisconsin.
La Crosse, Wisconsin. And I got connected to you through Mike Mayer. And,
Right.
And I just thought it was so interesting because we did a program on Iwo Jima and the flag raisers several weeks ago with Eric Krell, who is the one who made the great discovery that John Bradley was not in the famous Joe Rosenthal Iwo Jima flag raising photo. And of course, we got into the weeds with all the details of the gung ho photo that came before, and you know the various Marines who were on Iwo, and we followed up a little bit because Jack Watson, who's with us here, fought on Iwo Jima. Larry Kirby, who's come on the program, was on Iwo Jima, and then kind of Mike said, "Hey, you know, I know Kirk, who was close with a veteran who also fought on Iwo Jima," and I'm just going to share. Let's see my screen here so that why don't you tell people a little bit about your connection to Iwo Jima?
Well, many years ago, I met a gentleman whose dad was a corpsman on Iwo Jima, and his name was Jerry Zimi. When I met actually, it turned out to be Jerry's son. We were, small talk to start out with. And then he asked me where I worked. And I told him where I worked. And then he said, well, that used to be my dad's place. And I went, oh, okay. And so tell me more about your dad. And so then he went into this whole story about him being on Iwo Jima, but then never being recognized for being on Iwo Jima. And so I got really interested in finding out more about all of that. And it turned out Jerry, his whole life was goes to get corrected that actually Jerry Zimi was the 40 on the original flag raising. And in this photograph you're showing now, he's actually in the middle behind everybody. If you go, you just kind of in the shadows there. And so, and he was misrepresented, shortly after the listed as, I forgot the name now, but he would hand out business cards, and I have probably a dozen of them that he would, to anybody and everybody, he'd hand them out and to show that he was. And there's Jerry right there. Yeah, there's the business cards he would hand out, a little arrow to his name, and then of course his on the back of the bid. Tell it was or the groups that he was involved in. I instantiated it because it was, sorry.
Go ahead.
I was going to. Of course, the first thing that I did was to. Of course, you're always going to question a lot of this stuff. But the first thing that I did then is I purchased 5th Marine Division book from World War II. In the 5th Marine Division, the Spearhead book, he is listed in there as one of the corpsmen. And it's interesting, just actually as of today, I do a photograph, which is kind of ironic, of Jerry and Bradley's dad standing side by side after it must be after the first raising, right there, that photograph there. The two guys in front, as it states there, Bradley is on the left there, and Jerry on the right, both corpsmen. And there's Rosenthal background with his camera. I just stumbled across that today, which I thought was kind of saw it before.
Great photo. Yeah.
But I'm just here today. Yeah.
I was just going to remind people that, they'll remember that the famous Iwo Jima flag raising photo was taken 4 days after the landing, the invasion of Iwo Jima, atop Mount Suribachi, planting the American flag on the highest most point on the island. And Joe Rosenthal, was he AP, UPI? I can't remember. Photographer, took he took several photos, but the first one he took was actually this one, and he called it the gung ho photo shot.
Gung ho photo, right?
Gung ho photo, where people who were Marines who were atop Mount Suribachi gathered around the flag. They put up this big flag, and he took the photo. And Rosenthal actually thought that this was going to be the famous photograph, but then this flag was ordered to be taken down and put on a ship and given to James Forrestal, who was the Secretary of the Navy. And so a second flag was put up, and that was the second flag raising, which became the famous photograph. And I guess Jerry Zimi had talked about that he had served on Iwo Jima. And from what I've read, after James Bradley's book, Flags of Our Fathers, came out, and after he was misidentified as somebody else, Jerry felt very hurt that people started actually questioning whether he served on Iwo Jima or not.
At all.
And he was devastated by the suspicion that he might not have served. And so he kind of went all out in the final, years of his life to just demonstrate the simple fact that is in fact him, and it is him. It is him. Here
Right.
he is. He
Right.
was a Navy corpsman, just like John Bradley was a Navy corpsman. I don't know. Did he ever share with you any, his thoughts on that book, Flags of Our Fathers, or his thoughts on John Bradley and James Bradley, the author?
Well, that's actually a story in itself. Jerry contacted Bradley and, expressed his concerns about the misrepresentation in the gung ho photograph in the book. That got into a heated scenario where it got to the point where I don't think it was Bradley, but maybe a publisher or somebody accused Jerry of trying to, getting, money from Bradley from the book or something like that. Well, it turns out my uncle Terry Collins represented Jerry Zimi in a suit over this. And which is, kind of another twist of this whole story, but it was proven out of a reasonable, reasonable doubt that it was Jerry, and all Jerry wanted was just to have his name in the book. That's all he wanted. He didn't want any money. He wasn't talking, just wanted it corrected.
Yeah.
And it's never ironic to today that it's kind of flipped. Jerry's correct, Bradley is not, but that's trying to bring a bad situation, but yeah, it's quite an interesting story from that standpoint too.
Yeah, it sure is. In the book, he was misidentified. Very simple mistake that could happen.
True.
Anywhere, anytime, I think. But it's heartbreaking to think that he had to suffer with the idea that people were doubting his story. Yeah.
Right.
And you're right. Here is John Bradley here on the left. This is Jerry Zimi right here, also a Navy corpsman attached to the Marines. And there's Joe Rosenthal, the photographer, taken after photo was taken after the gung ho photo was taken. And this was Jerry's business card that he had on the back of Semper Fi with a gung ho photo shot. This is so wonderful. So it's because of your relationship to Jerry that you've become quite an expert on the Marines in the Pacific in World War II. Is that
I wouldn't
right?
call myself an expert, but I'd call myself an avid fan and follower, I guess it would be the way to look at it. But fascinating stories, one after another.
Absolutely. And I just want to, Jack Watson is here with us. He was a Marine who served on Iwo Jima. So you'll be happy to be able to meet him here. Thank you, Kirk, for coming and joining us. And I just want to welcome you to join us anytime you can, especially next week when we have Mike Mayer on.
I will be
We're
on for
talking
sure.
about Titanic.
Looking forward to that too.
All right. Very good. Hey, I want to make sure that I also share Henry Shopkey's website again. Henry, let people know again what your website is.
It's like a website where it shows like all the pictures and stuff of the autographs in my collection, and I have also videos and some other stuff.
I'm going to show it here. I'm going to share it. Let's see if I can figure this out. Do you know how to work a computer, Henry? Because I have trouble. Okay, here we go. So this is your website with your autograph collection. And I have to say, I've been going through it. I've talked about it a few times. It's really worthwhile going through here because you have some very interesting, World War II veterans that we've talked about before. Phil Coyne, who's a Pittsburgher, George Shultz, former Secretary of State. We go through, I've mentioned them before, but you also have a lot of other interesting historic autographs. Jimmy Carter, for example, George W. Bush, Laura Bush. You have Medal of Honor recipients. You have Bill Clinton. You have, here's one of my witness to the Hindenburg disaster. You have this, the autograph of the iron worker who helped to build the St. Louis Arch and gave the radio signal to fit the last piece into place in 1965. But this one, Henry, is my favorite of all your autographs because I've never heard of this. Okay, look at this one.
No
Look at
way.
this. You have the guy who claims to be the guy in the Bigfoot costume of the famous Bigfoot photograph.
Yeah, that was a pretty fun one.
That is a fun one. I've never heard that there was somebody who claimed to be. So he says that he posed as Bigfoot for the photograph.
Yeah, well, he says that he was like in a costume and he was the one in the photo.
And you got his autograph.
Yeah, I sent him a letter and he signed it.
I love it. You have Colin Powell. You have Linda Bird Johnson. Some of you will be old enough to remember Linda Bird, who is the daughter of Lyndon and Lady Bird Johnson. Gerald Ford's daughter. Oh, this is so great. So great. So I do encourage people to check out your website. Henry, could you put the website into the chat here on the Zoom side?
And I have the photos of the signatures of the pilot, Earl T. Williams, in the Pearl Harbor photo on that website too. So.
Okay. Yes. Very good. And so please, if you can, put that website link here on the Zoom side, website link on the Zoom side. And also, you also have a video that I want to let people know about, where you describe how to navigate your website and find the here you go. Find the autographs that you're looking for. So he walks you through it, shows you how to get to the various autographs. If you wouldn't mind putting this link also in the chat, Henry, that would be great. Just so that people could check it out and see what you're up to. Thank you so much for doing all this work and tracking this history. Do we have other people here who have Pearl Harbor information, memories, stories to share? Because otherwise you're going to get a Todd DiPastino lecture. Nobody wants that except me. All right, Chris Perello.
This is sort of like a period on the sentence here. This is Pearl Harbor, 1986. I had the honor to go there and participate in an exercise called RIMPAC. It's an annual exercise, and I was sent to the USS Carl Vinson, and we were going to sail down south of Hawaii and do this exercise. We got there late in the day, so it was kind of dark, and I didn't know the lay of the land once we got into the harbor. Checked the board, and then the next day in daylight, had about an hour before I had to report to the work center. We went up on deck, and we were pulling out we were pulling away from the pier. The tugboats were taking us away from the pier, and everybody was on the starboard side, the right side of the ship, staring at, gawking at, and photographing the USS New Jersey, the battleship New Jersey, which was 2 piers over from us, which was rare. And she was still commissioned, she was still active. And then everybody on the battleship was gawking and photographing the carrier pulling out. So it was kind of humorous, kind of a funny thing there. When you pull a vessel away from the pier, once it is on its own power with forward momentum, they order underway shift colors. The flag comes down off of the stern, and the flag goes up on the mainmast, and you are now on your way. Not long after that, we heard boatswain's pipe, and they called passing USS Arizona, all hands attention to port. No, all hands render honors to port. Everybody did an about face and came to attention. And we stayed that way until the two masts and the two ensigns passed each other. The one flying on the Arizona Memorial and the one on our main mast. And then they blew the pipe, called two, and then everybody went over to that side of the ship and took pictures of the Arizona. I unfortunately did not have a camera with me because I was on the way somewhere I couldn't bring one. But we were almost right on top of it. I was surprised at how close we had been berthed all that time. So we passed by, and from there we sailed down the channel, and there were people on all sides of the channel waving goodbye. I have no idea what their relationship was or whether they come out and see every vessel off here, but we're going down the channel, and I'm standing here, I'm thinking to myself, my God, I'm making a transit down this channel that Halsey and Michener and all of them had transited. All those incredible vessels moved right down through this water. And here I am. I couldn't believe how lucky I was. So that was very, very eventful. But the thing I wanted to really tell you about, the whole thing this leads up to, is when we got back, we had a day before we came back to Pittsburgh. We were on Ford Island, and there were 3 destroyers from the Japanese Defense Force moored side by side. And Japanese sailor, they had beautiful 20-foot lays, Hawaiian lays in white and orange colors as their flag on the bow, on the bows of these ships, you know, just blanketing them. It was a beautiful sight. I have a picture I've failed to find for you today, but I'll find that. But there they were, Japanese, moored on Ford Island, and there were Japanese sailors in uniform walking around with their cameras like tourists taking pictures. And the thought in my head then, an awakening in my head was, your enemy of the past may someday be your ally of the future. And that was 1986. Then we see how we are now with Vietnam. And then we see how when Berlin Wall fell, the Iron Curtain countries, some of them are NATO members now. Yeah. And I think of that every time something like that happens, but it was amazing. 86 Japanese destroyers moored at Ford Island as part of a joint Navy exercise in 1986. And I'm sure, by the way, that all ships who pass the Arizona render honors to this day like that. Yeah. So I just want to put that period on the story.
Oh, how interesting. What an honor. Yes, Don Nemchek.
Yeah, Todd, I just want to add, this is just compelling information.
Oh, that time already.
And, I really
hold on, I'm just, let me mute someone here. I'm sorry. There we go. Okay, go ahead.
I just want to add to this, the magnitude of Pearl Harbor. There were 51 Navy crosses as a result of the bravery of the sailors and the Marines of that day. And also there was 15 Medals of Honor issued, most of them posthumously. And of course, the Admiral Kidd, was awarded a Medal of Honor. He stood on the USS Arizona and kept command of that group of ships and everything until of course, the Arizona sunk and everything. But just think of that, 15 Medal of Honors, 51 Navy crosses, which is the second highest award for bravery. I am sure there is probably more that was earned, but due to the chaos of the day and everything else that they just never reported. So it's just the magnitude of this event is noteworthy just by those numbers alone.
Yeah, 15 Medals of Honor from that day
That day.
And 51, did you say, Navy crosses?
That's right, 51 Navy crosses. I think the 15 Medal of Honors was about 65% of the Medals of Honors issued in the entire World War II. I might be wrong on that. I'd have to check, but I remember that number somewhat distinctly.
Jeez. And that brings to mind something that Jack Watson said once, and that is that really struck me. I think I've heard this, very early on when I met Jack, and I think a lot of you veterans will probably can relate to this. Jack had just read a citation of a recent Medal of Honor recipient, and he said something like, "I saw that happen every day on Iwo Jima." In other words, he saw that kind of valor every day in combat on Iwo Jima. Those who received the Medal of Honor, they just happened to be the ones who, made it through the bureaucratic chain and got the recognition. I like to think of the Medal of Honor as kind of the tip of the iceberg. They're the ones that we see and hear about, but there's a lot we never do hear about and never see. And yeah, Jeff Witherall.
I just wanted to put a plug in for two organizations on the Pacific. The one that I was fortunate to go on a tour down there is called the Home of the Brave Tour. There's a lot of different tour agencies in Hawaii, but this was really significant because they really do a great job taking all the places of Pearl Harbor, significant to World War II, but they also related to the movies. And they talk about this happened in this movie, this happened in Tora Tora, and all these kind of things. And they relate what's true, what's false, what's cinematic. And now that's far away, so I don't know if you'll get to see that or go to that one. But the closer one is the National Museum of the Pacific War in Fredericksburg, Texas. That's about an hour's west of Austin, and that's actually the Nimitz Museum. And Fredericksburg was his hometown, and it's a heck of a museum about World War II in the Pacific. It has all the information there, everything preceding the war all the way through to the end, and from that there, and plus other things I've read, when Nimitz came in a day or two after Pearl Harbor to take charge of the fleet, he did a big tour of the harbor and everything and saw all the damage and everything. And when he got finished, the helmsman there on his yacht was saying, "Well, I'm sorry it's so bad, sir." And he said, "Actually, it's not as bad as I thought." And he said the three things that they didn't get, he says, were the submarine pens, the oil depots, and the dry docks. He says, so in that case, he had that fleet back on its feet in 6 months.
Yeah.
Because of that. And they didn't have to send a lot of things to the West Coast. They did, but they got these things out of the water. But that was a heck of a tour, and the information these people have is just tremendous there. So if you have a chance, either one of those places will tell you a lot.
And that kind of gets us into the whole point of why the Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor. I couldn't get away with not giving a little bit of history. Why they attacked Pearl Harbor to begin with, they deliberately didn't hit the oil depots and the dry docks because those are items that the Americans would use months down the road if they were going to fight a war with Japan. The whole purpose of the attack of Pearl Harbor was to keep the U.S. out of the Pacific, out of war with Japan. The two countries had been heading to war for years, literally years. In fact, World War II really started on July 7th, 1937, when Japan went to war with China. So by Pearl Harbor, Japan had already been at war for over 4 years. They had already lost almost 300,000 men in the Second Sino-Japanese War, which is what they called World War II, their war with China. And the U.S. was very much of a latecomer. We kept on threatening to enter the war or help out. We were helping out through Lend-Lease China in the war against Japan. And the Japanese just kept pushing it and pushing it and pushing it. And finally, they pushed it so far by invading what we call Vietnam, what was called then Indochina. They invaded Indochina, they took it over. And so in the summer of 1941, the U.S. declared an oil embargo against Japan. And this was the equivalent of war, really, because Japan has no natural resources. Almost, you know what they have a lot of? Fish. That's about it. They have no minerals, no iron, not much coal. fish and rice. That's pretty much it, and not even that much rice. They don't have a lot of arable land. So if Japan was going to be an empire, which is what it wanted to be, it was going to have to conquer a heck of a lot of Asia to get there. And one of the main things that they needed was oil. They couldn't get oil. They didn't have access to oil. They had to buy almost all their oil from the United States. They bought lots of oil from the Gulf of Mexico, from Texas. And when the US shut that off, Japan, which was fighting a war, now had 6 months of oil reserves left. They knew that their option was really to go where the nearest supply of oil was, and that was owned by the Dutch, the islands of Sumatra and of Java. They were called the Dutch East Indies. And the Dutch were preoccupied. They were, by this time in 1941, they were occupied by the Germans. And so they had lost control of these two islands. And Japan knew that this was their shot. They were going to take over these islands and get those oil fields there. The problem was they knew that the United States would not like that. Great Britain would not like that. And so they knew that they were going to have to, if they were going to take Sumatra and Java, they would also have to take Singapore, which was a British naval base. They would have to take the Philippine bases that the US had, because after all, it's one thing to drill oil there. It's another thing to transport it back to Japan. They had to take it through this corridor where they were going to be passing Singapore and the Philippines. They had to secure that route, that ocean route, that sea lane from the oil fields of East Asia back to Japan. And that meant just a sprawling kind of war. To take these two islands, they need Singapore, then they need to attack the Philippines, and they need to take Guam, and they need to take Wake Island. And finally, they could get all that, but the US would still be tempted to enter. And so they thought if they could just convince the US that it would be too much of a pain to launch a war to force Japan out of these areas of East Asia, they should take out Pearl Harbor. And so that was the idea behind Pearl Harbor: destroy the Pacific Fleet, or as much of it as you could, and buy some time to sue for peace with the United States that would allow Japan to keep what they had taken in China, especially Manchuria and French Indochina. The attack on Pearl Harbor, and I know I'm blabbing on, but I think this is just so interesting and so important, was, Admiral Yamamoto was the brain behind the attack on Pearl Harbor. He even knew that it was a mistake. And he said it many times in many different ways. His most famous quotation is that it's awakening a sleeping giant. But I think the more interesting quotation is, to fight the United States is like fighting the whole world. Doubtless I shall die aboard the Nagato. Meanwhile, Tokyo will be burnt to the ground 3 times. It is obvious that a Japanese-American war will become a protracted one. As long as the tides of war are in our favor, the United States will never stop fighting. As a consequence, the war will continue for several years, during which our material resources will be exhausted, vessels and arms will be damaged, and they can be replaced only with great difficulties. Ultimately, we will not be able to contend with the United States, a country, after all, which is twice the population, 10 times the industrial output as Japan. As a result of war, the people's livelihood will become indigent, and it is hard not to imagine that the situation will become out of control. We must not start a war with so little chance of success. And that, I think, is a wonderful kind of, coda to the conversation about Pearl Harbor. And does anybody have anything else, any comments or corrections or stories to share? Oh, Carol Kopchak, how are you?
I'm fine, Todd. I just wanted to share a piece of memorabilia, and I don't know if any of your World War II era members will remember any of these, but my husband was also a collector of, things related to the military, and I have in my possession 2 buttons. One, the typical, almost political button, remember Pearl Harbor. And this other very interesting one. On the red, it says remember, then there's a pearl in the middle. As you can see, it's dimensional.
Oh, how neat.
And harbor. And I don't know if anybody remembers these from the 1940s, or but they're the typical button, with the little safety pin type device on the back. So they always come out at the beginning of December to a prominent place in the living room. So I remember to remember.
Yes. And, Jeff Witherell.
I just make one final comment about the ironic thing about the attack on Pearl Harbor was it was in the nature of the Japanese. The Bushido doctrine, basically required the Japanese to surprise attack. That was their tenet. They always surprise attack their enemy. And that started all the way back in the 1900s, or actually the late 19th century, when they changed over to the Bushido doctrine. And it's surprising when you read about this. I even asked my dad, who was a World War II veteran out of New Guinea and disabled, retired out of New Guinea. And I said, did you ever read anything about the nature of the Japanese? And he said, no. And I said, you never read anything about the enemy? He said, no, only what we had in intel reports and that before battle or something, but I never read their history. I never read their nature. That it was expected they were going to surprise attack. That's the way it was made. They were made that way.
Yeah. And the whole Remember Pearl Harbor was important because although Pearl Harbor got the U.S. involved in World War II, the War Department and the Roosevelt administration very immediately all agreed that the war against Japan was not the first priority. The first priority was the war in Europe. That was the war that isolationists were against. We talk about isolationism was a very powerful force in the U.S. in 1940, 1941. Almost half of all Americans thought that we should stay out of the war in Europe. If you asked Americans, should we go to war against Japan? Most Americans would have shrugged and said, yeah, sure, that's not a problem. It was the war in Europe that most Americans were against. And that was going to be the tough one. And so the emphasis was always going to be first on Europe. And then when that was over, we would turn the full force of, our military might against Japan. So it was very difficult to tell the American people at the time, to kind of hold their horses about the war in the Pacific, because Americans wanted revenge for Pearl Harbor, and we kind of had to wait. And eventually, yes, Leo.
Made it easy because he declared war on America before America declared war on Germany.
You're talking about Hitler, yes. On December 11th, Hitler declared war. I mean, what a foolish error. That really was an unforced error that made it very easy for the U.S. to get into war against Germany. And I think it was because both Hitler and Japan really thought that the U.S. was, sure, we were a big, powerful industrial country, but we're very individualistic. We don't tend to pull together for things. We're a competitive, enterprising economy. It's not a command economy that can be turned wholly to war very quickly. We're separated by the Atlantic and the Pacific. We're isolationist by nature. We probably won't get involved, or if we do, we won't stay in a war long. Boy, that was a huge miscalculation. Huge.
I was going to say, Todd, the interesting thing about the Japanese is almost a dichotomy where you were talking about scarce resources, but then they kept trying to make this specific a big Japanese lake, and they kept extending out, and they had very poor coordination. People who read about this, it's surprising the poor coordination they had between the Army and the Navy and the Japanese side. And the Navy kept going on and taking islands, and then they'd say, okay, Army, come in and occupy that thing, and we'll keep you supplied. You just take care of that island. And all of a sudden they're dying on the vine out there because we're knocking out their ships.
Mm-hmm.
That was the way that's how we defeated them. We cut off the supply line.
Yeah, it's fascinating. We could certainly spend more time just talking about the background to just the beginning of the war. I mean, the background is totally fascinating. And I promise you I will shut up and end this program, but I just want to leave you with this thought that, in 1853, the Japan had been an isolated hermit kingdom for 250 years. No Japanese person could leave. Nobody from outside could come in. It was truly a feudal, medieval kind of society. There was a very weak emperor. There were just 300. Kirk, here you go. Kirk is showing something here. What are you showing, Kirk? Why don't you unmute yourself?
Unmute. Just was gonna. I just got done actually finding this book. I don't know if you can see it. There it
Hirohito.
comes. Yeah, it's one I stumbled across, which is unbelievable. I stumbled across it in a Goodwill store. And if you want to read, like you were just talking about, Todd, this is probably one of the most fascinating books I've ever read on the history before and during and after World War II. It was probably one of the most enlightening books, and put together or really answered a lot of the questions I always had about their rise to power and fall.
Yeah.
Just something to throw out there if people are interested in reading something. And the other thing that's nice about it's an older book. It's nothing. I'm not sure exactly when it was written, but it seems to me to be a little more closer to the interview Hirohito and it's firsthand account stuff.
Yeah. Yeah. And Hirohito was part of the Meiji Restoration, a result of the restoration of a more powerful emperor. Japan essentially went from being a medieval feudal society to a modern industrial society in 30 years. It's remarkable. Chris.
Todd,
Yeah.
General MacArthur had them bring Admiral Perry's flag to the Missouri for the surrender. Did you know that?
Yes.
He wanted to take them full circle from when we opened them up through the war, and now we need to open you up again. That was kind of a message he was trying to tell. Amazing.
Yeah. The Japanese still refer to this period in 1853 when the Admiral Matthew Perry, who was the younger brother of Oliver Hazard Perry, I think, right? For the War of 1812, Admiral Matthew Perry approached Tokyo, which was called Edo then, with 4 steamships that the Japanese had never seen. And they were warships, and they were all black. He had 60 or 70 guns and 1,000 sailors, and demanded to see the emperor with a letter from the president, Millard Fillmore, demanding that Japan open the country up to American trade and allow American coaling stations in Japan. And this is something he didn't know, that the Japanese emperor at the time actually had no power, didn't have the power to make that kind of decision. But they eventually capitulated, and this is what turned the Japanese to become an industrial power. The Japanese still speak of this as the time of the black ships. And when I've heard that even today, when Japan feels threatened from an outside force, they refer to it as the return of the black ships. This is legendary. It's not something that Americans really remember, but it is legendary in Japanese history. Boy, what an interesting afternoon. Thank you, all of you. Thanks to all of you this afternoon. I hope to see you again, Kirk and Mike. We'll see you next week. Warren, Mary, thank you for joining us. Vic, thank you all. Dan, good to see you, Dan Vaughn. I always love it when you unblock your... Yeah, you have something to say.
Yeah, you got a second?
Yeah.
We boarded an APA in California with the Marines, and on our way to Okinawa for training, we stopped at Hawaii, Pearl Harbor. We had about a 5-hour layover on the APA, and my buddy and I decided to go off the ship and go over to the Arizona. They had a wooden walkway over top the Arizona, and we were amazed. We just I think we both lost it because we were so close to the Arizona and so close to all those people that were still on the ship and just had died there. It was just amazing. It really was.
Oh boy, that's on my bucket list for sure. I've never been there.
And it's like going to a funeral home when you go there.
Yeah.
We figured we would never be this way again, ever again. So we decided we'd go over and see it. And we were glad we did.
Yeah, that was very smart. Oh boy, how neat. I hope you'll join us tomorrow, which is Pearl Harbor Day. At 7 p.m., we'll have our happy hour, the same Zoom link, and we'll be continuing this conversation. We'll also be talking with Jim Roberts, who served in Vietnam in the Army with a mobile advisory team. I hope you'll join us. See you then tomorrow, 7 p.m., happy hour. Enjoy your Sunday evening, everyone.